17 minutes to 5 p.m. Central African Time. Welcome back. You are tuned into Salam Media. It is, of course, the weekend edition of the Iftar show as we count down to Iftar time in the major cities across the country. And of course, while we do that, food might be quite at the top of our thoughts at the moment. And of course, relating to that is a conversation around inequality and unequal access to a healthy diet. And to unpack this further, I'm joined now by Brittany Kesselman, a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Cape Town. Good afternoon and welcome to Solar Media.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much.
All right, serious conversation to be had here. We're looking at unequal access to healthy diets in South Africa, and we'll talk about all about the solutions that might be at hand when it comes to tackling this. But I think let's begin here with the discussion around food security in South Africa and what does inequality have to do with this?
So we have basically a food crisis at the moment in South Africa. And what we see is that about a quarter of the population is food insecure, and more than half of the population cannot afford a healthy diet. And because South Africa is such an unequal country, what it means is that a small number of very wealthy people have access to all of the best food that they would ever want, while a huge proportion of the population goes to bed hungry or experiences malnutrition or is only able to access very unhealthy foods, which tend to be the least expensive. And so, in addition to being malnourished, they may also be experiencing diet related diseases like diabetes, hypertension, strokes, and others.
Mm. Now, when you look at the food system, which you say is made up of the various activities involved in the production, as well as the processing, the transportation, the selling, the consumption, all the way to the disposal of food, you say this food system produces unequal access to nutritious foods. What do you mean by that? And how do you think this food system is contributing to this inequality?
Right. So basically, the food system in South Africa is designed around, and the world is designed around profit. That is the main factor that drives the food system from production through to retail. And so, if the issue is profit, and if you have large numbers of people who are poor, then they simply can't afford food. And so, rather than designing the system around ensuring that everyone has nutritious food, um, it's designed around profits for the corporations that are the main actors in the system. And as a result of that, and that is a very old system, it goes back hundreds of years. As a result of that, most people simply can't afford the food, which is why so much of it ends up wasted in this country. It is produced, there's plenty of food to feed everyone in South Africa if we wanted to. But instead, about one third of that food ends up in the landfill instead of going to those who need it.
Mm. And in a lot of the research that you've been doing around this topic, and I believe your research is ongoing with regards to this, you do argue that these structural challenges are actually found, the basis of these are actually found in colonialism and capitalism. Do you wish to perhaps explain to us further about that argument?
Sure. I think we're so used to the system that we have that we often don't think about where it came from or that there could be another model and another way of producing and distributing food in society. But in fact, there was another way in South Africa before it became a colony. And that way was a very different way to the one that we have now. But it's important to remember that, when Jan van Riebeck arrived and set up a settlement at the Cape in 1652, he did so not on behalf of a government, but on behalf of a corporation. And his role there was to increase the profits of the Dutch East India Company. And so all of what followed was really oriented towards profit. And the documentation from the correspondence of those times is there and is constantly about ensuring that there's more profit. And that led to increasing the size of the settlement, taking more and more land from indigenous people in order to do large scale farming that wasn't to feed the people here, but was to export back to the superpowers, to Europe, and also to other colonies. Again, around profit. And as you start to have these large agriculture plantations, then you need labor for those plantations. And people here were not interested in working there because they had their own food system and their own economies. So then enslaved people were brought in to do the work, or indentured workers, or people were captured and forced to work, because otherwise there wouldn't have been labor for those kinds of massive plantations.
Mm. Just help us understand then, how do the effects of these colonial roots, as well as this inequality, then manifest itself and play out in ordinary South African society today in 2023?
Yeah, so what we see is that those fundamental structures are still in place. So if we look at the distribution of agricultural land in this country, it is still highly unequal, and most Black South Africans continue not to have access to land. If we look at the food system, it is dominated by corporations, just as it was at the very beginning with the Dutch East India Company. And so you see that even during the COVID lockdowns, when food insecurity increased quite dramatically, and about half of South African households couldn't access sufficient food. The large corporate food retailers continued to show profits during that time. And things like fruit, which is very important for children for their health and development, we export about 90% of the fruit from this country to other countries, while children here don't have access and don't get enough nutrition.
Yeah. Now, before we look at some of the solutions which you think there might exist to address this inequality, um, when we look, the situation with regards to this, and we look at what's going on and how this has manifested itself, then we look at some of the solutions that have already been implemented. And these come in various forms. I would, hazard a guess to say that the food feeding schemes, for example, that take place in a number of schools across the country might also be one of the interventions that we've tried out over the past few years. Clearly, these are not really working, or not working as well as we expect them to be, and as well as they should be working. So what has impeded these interventions, and where do they fall short?
Yeah, so those interventions are really important because people are hungry, and they do help people access food, but they don't address the underlying structure of the system. And so, if I distribute meals to children in school today, or soup to people in my neighborhood today, that's great. They ate today, but what are they going to do tomorrow if nothing has changed? So, while it's good to be addressing the immediate need, if we want to see long-term change, if we really want to address hunger, then we do need to address the entire system and the fact that it's oriented around profit instead of around people's rights to have access to food.
Mm. And I think if you look at it, this has actually been quite a prolific political debate as well over the past few decades. Especially when we were looking at this transition from apartheid to the democracy, do we go the nationalism route, where we nationalize all the means of production, agriculture, all of that? Is this the way to then address these issues that stem from colonialism? And I think a lot of the conversation also deals with, if we're going to, what sort of approach, how firm should this approach be, and how drastic should it be? Because at the same time, you don't want to topple the entire economy, you don't want it to collapse, because then we'll have quite a huge issue on our hands there, and I think proportionately larger than what we've got at the moment. But that, of course, not to downplay the current situation that we find ourselves in, and where you mentioned earlier on that around a quarter of the South African population doesn't have that access to nutritious food. So, looking at some of the solutions that you think there might be out there, uh, let's start with decolonizing food systems. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so there's a global movement from indigenous peoples around the world calling for the decolonization of food systems. And in each place, that's going to look different because the cultures and the geography and the climate are different. But there's sort of some key core factors to that call. And it's really around finding new values that should inform the food system. So, as I mentioned, the current food system is about profit. That is the core value underpinning the food system. Um, but a decolonized food system would sort of go back to different values. And so, if we look at the indigenous food systems in South Africa and other parts of the world, traditionally they were very much more collective and not so independent or individualist in terms of both working together to produce food and also eating together. There was a lot of reciprocity. So I help you today if you need it, and then you help me the next time I need assistance. There was a real connection to the land. People didn't see the land as something you exploit. It was part of your world, and part the whole natural world. There was a strong sense of connection, and even a spiritual connection to the land. So there would be rituals and ceremonies around food production and getting a good harvest. And we lost a lot of those values along the way. Food would never have been wasted the way it is today while some people are going hungry. That would have been impossible in a previous system. And so I think, like you said, we don't want to immediately collapse the whole system, but we really want to think about what kind of a system do we want, what values should underpin it, and how can we create a system where the goals are really around ensuring everyone, receives their right to food instead of certain corporations make profits.
Mm. And I suppose as you say that, I can already hear a lot of people now screaming and their arms go up and they're like, you can't do this so suddenly, you're just going to collapse the entire system and it's not going to work. This might sound good on paper. It's in theory, it's good. It's a good idea. We need to change these things. Colonialism needs to be addressed. The effects of it need to be addressed, but we can't do it right now. Let's stall a little bit more. So how do you then suggest we go about implementing this change?
So, I mean, a change doesn't have to happen overnight, although some change immediately would be good because people are going hungry right now. I think, first of all, no one person, not me or anyone, has all the answers. It's really up to everyone together to design a new system that works for everyone. And that means a lot of engagement, a lot of participation, a lot of learning and relearning what other options there are, what worked in the past, what is working in the present in other places in the world that we might learn from. And so we can start to improve slowly what we do have. We can start to shift things slowly. There's certainly room for government intervention around things like super profits in the food system. There's room for improvements in the kinds of redistribution that we do with what we have right now. And then over time, people can start to advocate for the changes that we want to see.
What do you think? I think we are running out of time, so I'll just leave you with this final question: Is what do you think about that model that I see quite a number of nonprofit organizations have actually been introducing, whereby they actually empower communities to grow food on their own, and not rely on the system that we've just spoken about, where people, it's largely profit driven, but here we have communities now actually working to produce their own food and in that way hopefully uplift the community.
I mean, on the one hand, I think it's absolutely wonderful for people to produce their own food. It tends to be healthier food, it reconnects you to the land, and it does move you to some extent outside of the capitalist food system. But as long as people continue to exist in this wider economic system that we have, they will still need money for school fees or other necessities. And so we do really have to keep in mind that the big picture has to be addressed at the same time.
All right, I think much more to unpack there, but that's just as much time as we've got for that. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Right, you too. That was Brittany Kesselman, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Cape Town. Just touching the iceberg of around this conversation around inequality in the food system. Would really have loved to unpack that further, but unfortunately, that's just as much time as we've got for that conversation this afternoon. Nonetheless, at 4 minutes to 5 p.m., let's take a break. When we get back, we continue with the show.